What's going on, everybody?
You can do other things and you can explore different aspects of yourself and you can become a different person.
You can't use your voice, lift someone else's voice up.
Understand that you are a global citizen and you do have a responsibility.
Hello and welcome back to Life Outside the Box podcast. I'm back as your co-host, Abigail Kurnia, joined by my infamous and invaluable co-host, Asanti. And as the first official episode of 2025, and thank you to Kamiko for sponsoring today's episode. We have a very special guest, 16-year-old Brennan Jackson, who's on the podcast today to talk about his experience in disability advocacy, who I will give the floor to introduce himself.
My name is Brennan. I'm a 16-year-old student from Ontario, Canada, and I have a condition called cerebral palsy, and so that ableism is, I think, what we're planning to talk about today, and that is something that throughout my life I have experienced, researched, and done a lot of work in terms of I guess advocacy is something I'm starting to look into more now that I'm a little bit older and have a bit more of a voice.
Awesome. So, really appreciate you being here, Brennan. You know, maybe one thing I might ask you first off is, how would you define ableism? And I don't mean like the dictionary definition, but like for you, like how does it show up?
Yeah, so I've actually done a little bit of research into that. And so Google's definition of ableism is the unfair treatment of an individual, or it says the discrimination of an individual based on their physical, mental, or other capabilities. But what I've experienced and feel myself is that it's more so the different treatment as opposed to the discrimination. And I would say that because a lot of what I have experienced in my own life is a lot of pandering or coddling to me, even though it's not necessary all the time. So people might more so be less inclined to engage with me, or they might assume something about my capability as opposed to just asking.
And you mentioned that you had been doing a lot of research and advocacy into ableism. What sort of advocacy have you worked on?
Well, since as long as I can remember, I have done presentations whenever I go to a new school or something, like switching into high school or in elementary school. I did it when transferring from kindergarten to grade 1. I'd give my class a little bit of a rundown of my disability so that they knew what to expect in terms of why I was different. I sort of stopped that maybe around grade 5 or 6, but now that I'm older, I've noticed it within the school system at my high school, and so I plan to do a presentation for a few classes with a friend of mine at the school to sort of educate people on ableism, my disability, and just what I've noticed within the school. And so I plan to hopefully I think my plan is to do a staff meeting, and then any teachers that are willing to have me come to their class, I will go and do the same presentation for their class. And so that's one thing that I'm doing. This was another thing that I thought would be able to get my name out there or just get the message out there a little bit more. And then I am actually working with Asante on another project I think it's called Unsinkable Stories, that is going to share a little bit more about ableism and then some other experiences in my life as well. And that's most of what I've done so far. But I also have a passion for psychology, and I hope to be a psychotherapist at some point in my life. And so I have done a lot of research into the psychology behind ableism, um, and that uh, sort of the expertise that I've gone into when it comes to ableism.
Thanks for sharing all that. I think it's interesting that you
Hmm.
like talked for 5 minutes about all the things you did, and you're like, oh, that's it. But anyway, um, with like your advocacy, could you say a little bit more about, because you talk about your advocacy through the lens of, school, et cetera, but you want to bring it
Hmm.
out into the world more. Could you talk a little bit more about what you hope the outcome for your advocacy will be?
So, my like lens or view of advocacy is, I think, a little bit different than most people's. I often find that with presentations that I've seen on other forms of advocacy, whatever that might be, it often I find it's very blaming um, in some circles, and so I find that the way I am wanting to go about this is by educating people instead, and maybe hopefully changing people's minds as opposed to blaming people for maybe things they've done in the past or just like societal prejudices as a whole. And educating people so that they can, going forward, make the right decision, or going forward, have the tools they need to interact with other people with disabilities or interact with me as a person as well.
And you mentioned something that I've highlighted in my notes, the psychology behind ableism. That sounds very interesting. Would you be willing to touch on a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I started the research into that because something I realized is a lot of people that often have tendencies towards ableism don't always know that. Sometimes people um, do things that are sort of ableistic, but they don't mean to. Like, for example, offering to scribe or offering to cut up somebody's food for them when that's not necessarily something that they need. Because as a person with a disability, we work hard to gain the independence that we do have. And then so taking that autonomy away from us does hurt sometimes. But then it also, people don't always realize that what they're doing might be wrong because their heart's in the right place. And so I looked into the psychology behind ableism, and some psychologists and professionals, they classify uh, disabilities and ableism in sort of three different categories. Uh, one of which is the moral model, which sort of looks at like blaming people for their disabilities. That would be like, um, I like in some circles actually, like it would be blaming a person's disability on like sin or evil or like a curse or something like that. And then so it's they're looking at disabilities in a blaming way. And then another model is the social model, and that is looking at disabilities as a product of society not being accommodating enough. So, like, a disability is only a disability because there's not enough ramps or elevators or enough sign language interpreters. So, a lot of these models look to blame, which is something I came across in my research, and am trying to break it down to take the parts from it that can be looked at in a more positive light to, again, affect change as opposed to blame people for their disabilities or blame people for misconceptions.
So I'm curious, can you elaborate a little bit more on, what it looks like to do advocacy and not from a place of blame?
Yeah, so that's something because I'm only 16, and so I've started the research on that, but it comes from, I think, uh, my just beliefs as a person and the importance, because I've watched people change actually. Like I've watched friends and family that when I educate them, they're more willing to ask next time. Something I always say is just ask. And then that way there's almost no way for you to mess up. And because I know that as a person with a disability and somebody who has interacted with people with a lot of different disabilities, um, we don't get offended, or at least most of us don't get offended if you just ask, because then it proves that that you want to learn and you want to care and you want to know, um, as opposed to just assuming or looking at a person and just thinking, oh, this is what they would want, or this is what like, as opposed to like putting your own perception of them on them, asking them like what they have, like how they have adapted or what they do, so that you can help them best. Because sometimes we do need help, but we don't always need help.
And so you're 16 and going to, or hoping to pursue a career in psychology.
Yes.
How has that post-secondary search started? Are you feeling the anxiety
Uh,
yet?
I mean, I feel well on my way in terms of that. I actually came across this opportunity
Mhm.
through a contact in preparing for university. Um, and I think I have a school picked out, and a program. So I feel pretty confident, and I think at this point it's just because I'm still not quite at the point where I need to submit stuff for scholarships yet, but
Yeah.
I'm at the point that I can start thinking about it for sure and looking for scholarships that would be applicable to the field that I want to go into.
And do you have plans to sort of continue your education advocacy within a post-secondary environment? How does
I
that
would
look like?
So I would say so, yeah, because I've been surrounded by disability and ableism my whole life, and so it's something that I'm quite well versed in, and I've been versed in it for my whole life, and so I feel like I have a unique perspective that can take the education I would learn from psychology and take it into advocacy, um, and hopefully do something with that, and then I would also be able to maybe be a therapist within the disability community, to help others with disabilities deal with their mental health and life experiences, because that's something that I have experienced myself, and so it's something that I would be able to have a firsthand experience with, for sure.
Are you excited about that? Is that a thing you're excited about doing once you arrive there?
Yeah, I'm actually very excited. And that's something that's partially worried me, because I've always been told like don't turn your passions into a career. But I sort of reverse engineered that into turning a career into a passion. So was um I was good at like emotions and people from a very young age, and I have been, and so I've been told I'd be a good therapist, and so I did the research into what that would look like and what uh, the world of psychology looks like, and I found it very interesting and very fascinating, and so I've delved heavily into that field, even like as a high school student.
And you talked about the quote that stuck with me is affecting change and not blame, and how through like educating your family and your classmates and your peers, been able to change the way people view ableism and
Mm.
disabilities. And I'm curious if you have any stories that you'd like to share about how just simply asking, like you said, how effective that.
Yeah. So I mean, my friends, or like the people that I'm close to now, or the people in my community, um, the people that I'm like really close to were never like overly fearful of me, but I've seen people be afraid of me, or I've watched people like scowl at me or stare at me um in the hallways and stuff. And so this like through these projects that I'm doing, or educating teachers, has actually been a big thing. because I found that a lot of adults are the ones who believe they know better or they want to think that they know what's right, when that's not actually the case. And I've been able to help my teachers adapt to how to deal with other students with disabilities. Um, Again, my expertise is only within like physical disabilities and cerebral palsy, so I can't speak on any cognitive disabilities. Um, but I've been able to help my teachers know when to ask me if if I need a scribe, or when to ask me if I need to go to a different room, or like they've learned over the 3 years that I've been at the school, um, when to ask me, as opposed to just assuming that I'm going to need a scribe, or just assuming I'm going to need an extra space. Because there's sometimes that I do need both of those, but sometimes that I can just adapt in other ways, um, compared to just getting a scribe or another space.
You ever like meet resistance, when you were advocating, not even advocating for yourself, but really just kind of like, saying what your actual needs are and, that kind of thing?
Yeah, actually, I have a pretty, I wouldn't say necessarily recent story. So I also struggle with some anxiety, and that comes from just years of um, hard school and finding school a little bit more challenging because I've needed to adapt. And so there was one particular instance that has really stuck with me, and I've taken it through my advocacy journey because it was one of the bigger points in my education that made me go, I need to do something about this. And that was when I was taking a test and actually getting scribing help. I was stressed out because the scribe wasn't necessarily understanding what I was trying to articulate, um, and asked them to write. So they were writing something a little bit different than I wanted, and that had mattered for this particular test. And so I was starting to get frustrated. And then they asked me, like, are you okay? Like, what's wrong? I said, you're not quite understanding what I'm trying to say, and I don't feel like you're hearing me. And what the teacher said after that was, well, this is how I treat everybody. So they didn't say you're crazy or anything like that, but they said, they said, this is how I treat everybody. So can we like move on? Which made me think like, I kind of wondered like what their perception of the situation was, because I started to get frustrated because they weren't hearing me. And that made me wonder like, do they not hear the other students that they help? Because they were and are the teacher that helps with um, the other students that need help. Um, this wasn't a one-time occurrence that they helped scribe. And so that made me question, like, are there other students in the school that feel the same way I do? And that was sort of the catalyst to me thinking, do I need to do something about this within my school community?
You mentioned the quote, this is how I treat everyone. And I almost feel like that can be like a false perception of equality, sort of this
Hmm.
blanket statement that, well, everyone gets treated the same, so no one's left out.
Hmm.
How does that play into disability activism?
So yeah, that's one thing that I've noticed within my whole life of having a disability, is that the people who are qualified to help people with disabilities think that they need to put their training that they've learned into every single situation. But people with disabilities require different levels of help, or sometimes they just need very minimal help, and sometimes not at all, and it's just a space that they need. But sometimes I've found that the people in those spaces think that they need to put their training into use in every situation, which is something that has created a um, environment that to me sometimes feels unsafe, because it feels like I'm not being treated the way I need to, and more so uh, like a person with a disability as opposed to a person who needed some help.
You know, is it, and I'm just guessing here, so tell me if I'm
Mhm.
wrong. When folks do treat you that way, is there like a perception of not being seen?
Yeah, I've actually witnessed people step back or have looks of fear when I do stand up for myself. And it feels like it feels inhumane. It feels like it feels kind of like they perceive me like animalistically or something like that because I've witnessed them like step away in fear um, or get like a scared look on their face because they don't know how I'm going to react and they assume that I'm going to react out of proportion. Or at least this is my perception of their facial expressions and body language. Um, and so, yeah, that's something I've noticed for sure of like um, people reacting as if I'm going to react out of proportion and um, not actually understand what my disability is.
And we talk a lot about community on this podcast, and we've spoken to a lot of advocates who say while their work is meaningful, it can at times feel incredibly isolating and lonely.
Mhm.
Can you touch on the importance of community in your personal experience?
Yeah, so I have a great support system between family and friends, but I also have a good backbone and support system within the disability community too. I've done a lot of work with Kids Ability. That's where I got a lot of my volunteer hours, and I've met a lot of wonderful people there. And in fact, the person that I'm doing the presentation at the school with, I met through Kids Ability and have become family friends with. And so I found that his experience was important. And so in this presentation, I've tried to collect different experiences and different walks of life because I only have one walk of life. And so I didn't really feel like I could speak on behalf of all disability and all ableism for the school. So I wanted to get as many um, like experiences as I could.
You know, that's kind of very relatable to me as like a marginalized person. Sometimes it's
Mhm.
like, you know, they want you to speak on behalf of everyone's experience, but you know, there are obviously huge differences. Um, you know, excuse me. Um, I guess, you know, within, you know, the disability community, um, what are some of those things that like we, like the general population, maybe don't understand, um, that we need to understand better?
I mean, I think I've said this once or twice, but
Yeah.
um, my big thing is just ask. A lot of people are afraid to ask because they don't want to offend. But I have told myself, and this is a um, perception that I've sort of ingrained into my living life, is even if people are meaning to be offensive, I am teaching myself how to respond with an intelligent enough response that it'll throw them off their feet. So just asking questions um, is the big thing for me. Like, um, if you ask, that you're gonna get it right, no matter what. And even if you ask an offensive question, I may tell you it's offensive, and I may explain why it's offensive, but then if you're willing to ask, then you're probably more than willing to change. And so usually those are the people that are willing to change. And if you're not willing to change, then you'll stand out like a sore thumb among the people who are willing to change.
It's interesting how you said that, you know, you can't speak for everyone. You only have one personal experience. And I took a class this past semester where I studied a lot of disability scholars, and a common theme that I found thread in between all of their work was the notion of like performative activism, and a lot of people, like in this case, a lot of able-bodied people almost doing like the heavy lifting
Mhm.
for disability justice and like taking up space and often doing it wrong and harmful. Um, do you have any experience on that?
So I haven't witnessed a lot of disability activism, and what I have witnessed has been from other people with disabilities. So I've found that the minimal activism that there has been done properly, um, from my perception at least. Um, but I have also noticed that there's very little activism, and that's why I also thought it'd be important to reach out to as many places as I could to get my voice out there. And that's also another thing you were saying, like the voice aspect of it is I'm lucky enough to have physically have a voice because some people within the disability community don't. Um, and so speaking up for those who don't have a voice, who don't have the confidence to have a voice, who don't have the confidence to share their experience or the resources to share their experience like I do, I've been fortunate enough to have all of those things. And so taking the opportunity to do that is not just a service to me, but it's a service to the whole disability community.
I love that. Very noble of you. Uh, so, as I think about advocacy and all the work that you're doing, and you spoke just now about there not necessarily being like a great movement yet. Do you see that on the horizon, and sort of what breakthroughs need to happen for that to take place?
Well, I mean, I would like to think that I could be a change at whatever age, and that's why I think continuing with this for me would be a good thing. But I've also realized in my research that I have had to find like scholars or professors to back up my claims. And my hope for myself is that I can be that scholar or professor or educated voice in the disability community to back up somebody else's research because I won't be the solution or the um, cure for ableism. But I can start it or I can be a voice or a youth voice that shows that it matters. Because I haven't found much of that. I've found a few TED Talks on ableism, but that's been about it. And even like articles, there's been few. And in all the research I've done for school projects, just to have an understanding, just a wide variety of reasons, I have only found a handful. And that's been tricky for me for sure.
And the transition into post-secondary, it's very frightening and nerve-wracking for
Hmm.
everyone. I'm in my final year now, and I still remember my first day of university and being like scared out of my mind.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering, you said that in your high school and your elementary school days, you would go around to your classes and you would educate people as to,
Hmm.
what my disability is, right? And like the just ask. So I'm wondering if have you had to like think already about different ways to adapt to post-secondary?
So a friend of mine has connections within the school board that I've attempted to reach out to see if I like at the high school board level and including at some universities, like it's a full throughout the full school board. Um, and I thought about maybe reaching out to them to see if I could do a presentation for that committee or giving a youth voice for that committee to see if at that high level, then they would be willing to hear me and have my voice be something within the school board at the highest level. But also, the school that I specifically chose in my research has come up as a very good, like, they're a very accommodating and like I don't maybe kind is a word that I could use, but like they've done a lot for ableism and they've had other presenters with disabilities come in and teach about ableism, that are not I think they were faculty with that I saw, um, and so that would be something that I'd be interested in for sure, but I also understand that class time in post-secondary is very valuable, as well as the class sizes are much larger um, as well.
You know, as a question that keeps coming up in my mind as we've been talking in this conversation is the role of allyship. Now, is allyship one a thing that you believe in and is necessary? And well, maybe we'll just start there. Yeah, is that like
Yeah,
a thing that you feel is necessary?
I mean, I would say so because um, I have a lot of like wonderful friends and family that have been supportive in this, but I've also realized that even though I'm lucky enough and fortunate enough to have a voice, there are a lot of people who don't, and or those who do have a voice, their voice is just discredited because they do have a disability in a lot of communities. And so having able having able-bodied people show up and say, I learned from this person, or this person taught me something about themselves, or whatever it may be, shows that people with no disability or with uh, whatever, like people without disabilities um, can change, can learn, and can grow from people with disabilities. So it would show that um, our voices do matter if able-bodied people are willing to listen. And that it sounds kind of morbid to say, I suppose, but um, sometimes our voices are discredited because we have disabilities. I've seen in some spaces. And so having able-bodied people be able to back it up and not necessarily give the message, but say, this is a message I believe, or this is a message I've learned from, is something that I think is important as well.
And I had in my notes just starred like how to be an effective ally, but I kind of want to expand on that a little bit. You mentioned earlier about how if someone was to say something offensive, even if your heart is in the right place, the importance of breaking down like this is offensive and this is why it's offensive.
Yeah.
How important is that explanation part?
I think it is very important because activism is about change. And without explanation, there's not going to be any change because they don't know what was wrong or why it was wrong. Um, and so explaining why it was wrong and showing compassion to somebody who said something offensive shows, yes, I care enough to explain it to you, but I also care enough about you as an individual that going forward, I want you to be successful in talking to people with disabilities, in my case.
Like, how do you go about that piece?
Well, I've been like people have asked me all sorts of questions like um my wrist is sort of deformed or like so yeah, my wrist is deformed. Um And so people have asked me like, "Oh, do you have bones in your hand, or can is your hand extra flexible, or can you feel it when I touch like when I touch your hand?" And then they'll just like poke at my hand. And so I will like take a step back, breathe, and say, "Yes, I do have bones. I may not have as much feeling in my left hand as you do, but I can still feel you touching my hand right now." And so I'll go through a more in-depth but not incomprehensive explanation of why my hand is like this. Again, to my understanding as well, because I don't know everything about cerebral palsy. Um, so yeah.
And I mean, with such like extensive and like on the ground advocacy that you've been doing, have you ever experienced burnout in advocacy?
Because I'm sort of newer to it, I mean, balancing advocacy with schoolwork has been something I've found challenging because I've had to find time to create a presentation or prepare for this episode or things like that, or just think of what I might say, or even like just having to be on my toes in case somebody is going to say something offensive. I want to have at least somewhat of a response because if I'm assertive and like confident in my explanation, they're more likely to um hear the message as opposed to if I'm stumbling through it, it may not get through to them as well, for sure.
So with that being said, not even thinking about like the advocacy work, but you know, when you do have to support people in how to ask you, or how they should ask if you need support or help or any. Do you ever get tired?
Um,
Or
maybe when I was
Mhm.
younger, but as I've grown older, I've become more patient, and I understand that it takes time too, because um sometimes I catch myself wondering thing like because there I'm disabilities are obviously not the only marginalized group, and so I've found myself wondering or having questions, and I understand that I won't get everything right or get everything morally right on the first try, and so I understand that it takes time from my own experience of needing time, but also just I've witnessed it takes like maybe 5 or 6 reminders. And it usually only takes reminders. It doesn't take like freakouts or anything like that for people to be like, okay, I understand what I've done wrong here and I will be able to try and change.
And sort of reflecting a little bit in like your education work that you've been doing, is there like an overall lesson that you've learned through your work?
I would say that most people are capable of change. Um, and I've noticed that through um, not only my advocacy, but like people who I can now consider close friends may have not been as confident in asking me about my disability when we first met. Whereas now we're able to make jokes about it because that's something that I find helps me work through my own stressors with the disability is when me and my friends can joke about it and laugh about it, it makes it a bit lighter. And so I've changed as a person through this advocacy journey, but also the people close to me have changed too, because I've done more research that I've been able to share with them, and they've been along with me on this journey to learn.
you know,
So I've witnessed change.
that's
Go ahead.
amazing. I agree with you. I think, change is far more prevalent than I think we realize. Um, you know, in developing like these relationships, you talk a lot about folks feeling discomfort or not knowing how to approach you or, so like how do you kind of break that barrier of discomfort for folks?
I usually try and maybe go up to a conversation and shake somebody's hand, or I'll initiate a conversation with confidence. It won't necessarily be about my disability, or I will because I've noticed I'll start a conversation with somebody and their first thought will be to go to my hand, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I probably should have mentioned I have cerebral palsy and that's what my arm is and why you probably noticed me walking a little bit differently, or my lazy eye, so that they understand that I'm an approachable person when it comes to my disability, and so that I'm an approachable person when it comes to conversation too.
And when we were talking about community and sort of like how fortunate you are to have such a supportive community around you, the topic of safe spaces kind of came
Mhm.
into my mind. So I'm curious, how do you define a safe space?
Well, I often find safe spaces that I can laugh in, and because I find myself I don't normally laugh when I feel uncomfortable. And I feel like that's the case with most people. Um, and as I said previously, um, I, with my close friends, I feel I can laugh about my disability. And I mean, they've sort of, at this stage of my life at least, grown up with me, at least for the past few years. And so they've watched me grow in my physicality. Like I've had many surgeries over the years to help with my stability and stuff. And so they've watched me get more stable, get stronger. And so the safe spaces are, I find, with the people that I've known the longest or like trust the most and can really laugh with.
I really love that definition. I'm definitely gonna remember that. Um, how do we help make those spaces safer?
Um, I think asking, because the more you ask, the more you're going to know, the more you're going to learn, the more you're going to be curious. And then I actually had a friend who, after meeting me and after getting to know me and after getting to know a little bit about my journey with sports. So I fence, and so I'm starting to look into para fencing now so that I can start competing. And so a friend of mine looked into para sports to be more educated about the world of para sports, and that meant a lot to me because that showed that they cared and wanted to learn and wanted to hear and wanted to listen to my stories.
And what are you most excited for looking in the future? Not even just post-secondary or, it's a very big journey ahead. So it can be post-secondary if you wanted, but like now that you're on this education advocacy journey that you said
Mhm.
is recently new, what are you excited about?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I'm excited to be educated.
Hmm.
Again, as I was saying, I have a passion for psychology as well as it being the career path that I want to go down. Um, and so I think that um, this advocacy journey is something I've really enjoyed so far because I've been able to witness the change that it's made. And so I can see I'm making a difference, and I can see that um, interests are being had. And so um, continuing to go down this path, continuing to go down the path of psychology, and hopefully, again, being a reputable voice within the disability community that other youth or individuals can go to be like, you've done research in this, what do you think?
I really like that. So, thinking 10, 15, 20 years in the future, how do you imagine like all these different pieces of your life coming together?
I mean, I'd hopefully like to do a large presentation. I mean, for this throughout this journey, something like a TED Talk has been on my mind because that's a large stage that does reach a lot of people. And so, and even people who aren't necessarily interested in TED Talks, it trickles through education, it trickles through communities that aren't necessarily fully involved with TED. And so that would be something that'd be interesting to me is doing a TED Talk on ableism. And through my work with psychology, I've also done a lot of looking into mental health as well. Because that's something that I've also been very passionate about is others and my own mental health.
And how does, like, in your experience, mental health support um, with disability support, how do they connect?
Well, in some spaces, like mental health disorders or like things like anxiety at a certain level are themselves considered a disability because they can be crippling if or depression. They can be heavily affecting and they can be severe enough that you require help or you require assistance just like you might with a disability. So, in the work of disability advocacy, I'm also learning how to advocate for my own mental health and just advocacy in general for myself um, so that I can articulate what I need as well as I can.
What part does mental health play in your life, and your journey?
Well, I would say, having an interest in psychology, I've been able to be more aware of my own mental health. And so as soon as I started to notice some signs of anxiety, from school that would be maybe concerning levels, I immediately went to my parents and I was like, "Hey, I think I need to sign up for therapy because I think therapy is a great thing." Um, and so I was like, hey, I think professional help, at least somebody to talk to that can give me professional advice. So to, I went and started therapy as soon as I could, to tackle any anxiety before it got, too bad. And so, yeah.
And what would you say to someone who, wants and needs to reach out for these supports, but that fear and that sort of fear to be judged is weighing on them? What would you say to
I
help them
mean,
find their voice?
what I can say is that it's understandable because for a very long time I felt that, or even when I would do these presentations, I would doubt myself. And I don't know if either of you are familiar with the term of internalized ableism, but that's basically ableism that is within oneself, I suppose, um asking myself questions of like, am I being burdensome? Am I too slow? Am I too yada yada yada? I don't want to bog people down, things like that, that I have every right not to think, and I have no reason to think these things, especially if I have a strong support system like I do. But it can sometimes be like, am I in the right for asking what I need? And so I personally had a moment where I was like, okay, this is enough. I can't be in this environment if I don't do anything about it. And I understand that people may not have that, which is a fortunate thing for them. But so I was lucky enough to be a switch to say, okay, something has to change, as opposed to me thinking like, I can live with this, or you know what I mean?
I've met a lot of advocates in different areas of my life, and they
Hmm.
tend to be driven by, experiences, and within those experiences, emotions. Um, is there any part of like, is there any like emotion that really drives your advocacy? For me, I've definitely been, angry at injustice, and that's driven my advocacy. What about you? Are there any things that drive you?
I would say so, yes, especially because like a lot of where ableism comes from is misunderstanding, and so there's a disconnect that I find myself being frustrated with, like people not hearing me or not listening to me or not like understanding me, and so that disconnect has often created anger, or like I have a very unique experience within like my family and friends. I only have use of one arm, and so people around me have a hard time relating to that. And so even the people that are my best supporters sometimes struggle too. And so that's something that I've been like, okay, maybe I need to be more patient with, but there's been certainly frustration, I would say, has been the biggest emotional drive um, in my advocacy journey.
And sort of talking about your advocacy journey, and as we're reaching the top of the hour, something that we like to do when nearing the end of each episode is to ask our guests a very cheesy question, but often it's very valuable. Um, what's something that you wish you could tell your younger self?
Um, that um, I will be more confident, I suppose, is one way to phrase it, but that it, I suppose, gets better in terms of um, like in terms of the support I will have, in terms of my confidence, in terms of my physical and emotional strength too, because I didn't always have the confidence, and sometimes I still don't, to do these things that I'm doing now. And sometimes I have to push through the fear to get through to learning how to present like this. And so that it gets better, I suppose, would be the overall thing to say.
I love that. Um, is there anything that you'd like to say that we haven't gotten to today?
I wouldn't say so. I think we covered a lot of bases, actually. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I mean, you were talking a lot about how you hope that your voice um, invokes change, and I can tell you already that it
Hmm.
has.
Yeah.
Just in our short conversation, I've learned a lot, and in talking to you, the back of my mind's been ringing. I was like, oh, I have professors that would love to hear this. There's a lot of disability classes at I go to Trent University, and a lot of students that I know would love to hear this in like classes, and you're already making a change.
Hmm.
Yeah, and thank you again for joining us. This has been a really powerful conversation.
No problem. My pleasure. I've really enjoyed this.